Welcome to Capernaum. Join us as we follow Jesus' footsteps through this ancient village. Located on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee, Capernaum was an ancient fishing village and is considered one of the most sacred sites in northern Israel.
For me, being in Capernaum is a pretty remarkable experience. I've heard of this town, this village, probably for most of my life. You know, growing up in youth group, hearing the stories of Jesus healing and being in the synagogues and on the Sea of Galilee. It's pretty remarkable.
It's really important for me to see and come see these cultures of these people, especially ones surrounding Capernaum, and how much significance they give this place and how its holiness fulfills a part of them as well. And you know, as a little girl, all the stories with Jesus obviously interested me more than something like kings with all these different names and genealogies and all of that kind of stuff.
Capernaum is famous for its connection to Jesus' earliest recorded teachings. First mentioned in the 4th chapter of Matthew, Jesus is said to have traveled to Capernaum following his baptism in the River Jordan and rejection of the devil's temptation. It is in this same chapter which Matthew describes Capernaum as being by the sea in the borders of Zebulun and Naphtali. This location has been confirmed by various archaeological findings, including remnants of a village, a synagogue, and an octagonal church believed to have been built atop the house of St. Peter. Despite these biblical references, relatively little is known about the ancient village's history.
So historically, Capernaum, we don't know much about it outside of archaeology and the Bible, which makes it tricky to understand much about it. But what we do know is that it was an out-of-the-way place in an out-of-the-way region. It looks very grand. We've just been through the synagogue, which is mostly a 1920s reconstruction of a lot of materials that were found in excavation. So it looks roughly what it would have looked like, probably in the 4th or 5th century. Even though Jesus never would have seen these exact marble stones, he would have been at this site. We have a lot of good biblical information about what Jesus is said to have done here. But historically, this is a pretty out-of-the-way place, dependent almost entirely on the fishing industry, which in the 1st century was a boom or bust industry, much like it is today. Fast forward a few hundred years, as early as the 4th century, possibly earlier, we know that people were venerating the home of St. Peter in this place. In the 5th and 6th centuries, an octagonal church was built by the Byzantines on the site, the traditional site of St. Peter's house, and now we see the big structure of the modern church on top of that. What's so interesting to me personally being here is not just to see the landscapes and the types of buildings, like the basalt buildings that you see behind me, the foundations of those, not just to see those and think about the people that are venerated, not just Jesus, but St. Peter and Andrew walking through this place and visualizing that. But what's really interesting to me is the devotion to the place, starting roughly 300 years after the lives of these individuals. For me, it's like, how accurate is that? I don't think that's the right question, personally. I think the right question is, why and to what depth did people venerate this site?
Capernaum is the largest city at the time of Jesus. And we have to ask a question, why Jesus picked up the city to be the center of his activities? For 5 reasons. It was the largest city, the richest city, the city where the Roman officers' residential area. It's the city where the Jordan River gushes out from here 2.5 miles. And the most important, it was the custom city, that everybody has to come to this city and stamp their papers or passports to cross to Syria, which is in the northeast of this area.
We know that around 3000 BC, the city served as a small fishing village under the authority of the biblical city Tel Kinneret. Like many early civilizations, Capernaum began as no more than a collection of several small homes. For 1,000 years, the village seemed to experience little change in size, population, and the economy remained constant. However, the emergence of the Romans in the 1st century, and later the Byzantines in the 4th century, spurred financial growth and overall prosperity. Part of this sudden boom in prosperity was due to Capernaum's role as a customs office. Many residents found business servicing Roman caravans that arrived by way of the main roads. Before long, Capernaum found a greater purpose as a hub for Roman taxation. With its improved status and its continued success as a fishing port, the village flourished. In addition to fishing, industry and trade became major sources of income for the town. Capernaum's close ties to the Romans are reflected in Matthew 8, verses 5 through 13, when Jesus interacted with a desperate centurion, a Roman officer. This officer begs for Jesus' aid to heal his sick servant.
"Lord," he said, "my servant lies at home paralyzed, suffering terribly." Jesus said to him, "Shall I come and heal him?" The centurion replied, "Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, 'Go,' and he goes, and that one, 'Come,' and he comes. I say to my servant, 'Do this,' and he does it."
Capernaum's ties to the disciples can also be found in John 6. After the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus' disciples returned to Capernaum while Jesus stayed behind to pray. As the disciples embarked on their voyage, a storm began to buffet the boat. Suddenly, Jesus appeared, walking on the sea towards them, and after stepping on board, the boat immediately reached its destination.
One of the best parts about being in Capernaum is the fact that this was basically Jesus' home base with his 12 disciples. They spent a lot of time here. There were many healings, many of these things. But the other thing, that as we stand in the synagogue, the 4th, 5th century synagogue that was here, that is on top of the synagogue that would have been here at Jesus' time, I look out at the Sea of Galilee and I think that somewhere on that shoreline is where Jesus called Peter and his brother Andrew, and called the sons of Zebedee, James and John. And that is where he asked them, "Do you want to follow me and be fishers of men?" As I look at this, it says this in Mark chapter 1, verse 16. "Passing along the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon Andrew, the brother of Simon, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, 'Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men.' And immediately they left their nets and followed him. And going on a little further, he saw James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, who were in their boat mending the nets. And immediately he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired servants and followed him." Just out there, a few hundred meters away, is where 4 of the disciples were called to follow Jesus. It's a remarkable sight to stand in the place that happened over 2,000 years ago.
Because Jesus recruited Peter as a fisherman on the Sea of Galilee, it is safe to assume that Peter's house was in or around Capernaum. According to Matthew 8, verses 14 through 17, Jesus went into Peter's house to heal Peter's mother-in-law. The likelihood of Peter's house being in Capernaum is supported by archaeological evidence as well. In 1816, archaeologist J.S. Buckingham published a sketch of Capernaum, including what he believed to be an octagonal Byzantine church. In 1906, another archaeologist continued the excavations of the site and found the ruins of a simple house. Closer investigation of the house revealed an interesting transformation during the middle of the 1st century AD. In addition to being used as a simple dwelling, the house became a popular place for worship. This resulted in the house's main room being cemented over, a rarity reserved only for important occasions. Furthermore, the house's pottery appears to have shifted from cooking pots and bowls to storage jars and oil lamps. In later centuries, the room was renovated and converted into the central hall of a church. Using this evidence, excavators deemed this house as the most likely location for the home of Peter. A second important archaeological find in this village is a synagogue that has great significance in the Gospels. In Mark 1, verses 21 through 28, Jesus enters the synagogue and preaches.
They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to teach. The people were amazed at his teaching, because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law.
Purchased by the Franciscan order in 1894, the synagogue was first excavated in 1905. Initial investigation revealed that there existed two layers of the synagogue. The bottom layer, built with local basalt rock, was probably the remains of a Roman synagogue. Experts believe this was likely the site of the same synagogue mentioned in Mark 1. On the upper layer, archaeologists found a larger synagogue, built around the 4th century AD, which stands in visible ruins to this day. A synagogue of this size and beauty demanded substantial upkeep. The funds for this maintenance would be acquired through the temple tax, which required Jewish men to supply the temple with annual funds. Matthew 17, verses 24 through 27 reflect this when Jesus is asked about the temple tax for the Capernaum synagogue. While the men may have been asking an ordinary question, they may have wanted to ascertain Jesus' loyalty to the Jewish faith, foreshadowing the final questioning and the subsequent death of Jesus. Despite the many centuries that have passed since Jesus' time in Capernaum, the site remains a historic foothold in the rise of Christianity. The remnants of the Byzantine octagonal church remind all onlookers of Jesus' miraculous healing of Peter's stepmother, while the white limestone synagogue stands as a testament to Jesus' teachings. Even more, as one stands out on the glistening Sea of Galilee, standing on the rocks which Jesus called his first disciples, it is impossible not to feel God smiling down on all visitors of this ancient village.